Welcome to the Open Door Podcast. My name is Anthony. This is a conversation with Jasmine Lo. She was born in Hong Kong, but since her birth, she has been a third culture kid, living and making memories in places such as Tokyo, Gothenburg, Frankfurt, Paris, and soon London. In this episode, we explore writing about family and the craft itself, and also her thoughts on culture, belonging, and identity. She is an illustrator and creative writer, and also a bookstagrammer. So if you're interested in literature, aesthetics, and its combination, I'll post her socials in the description, so you can check out her page. As usual, the episode timestamps are in the description, but without further delay, this is Jasmine Lo. Hi Jasmine, thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Thank you for having me.
No, absolutely my pleasure. So I thought in this episode we'd do something different. So, you're a creative writer, and I decided to start off this segment with just an excerpt from one of your writings that you've done. Before we start, can you explain where this excerpt comes from?
So I recently wrote a piece that is essentially a letter to my granddad, a granddad who I never got to meet because he passed when my mum was still a teen. And I guess his presence has been really special in my life, even though I feel that, even though I haven't actually met him, emotionally, mentally, he's influenced my life. So I thought I would write him a really sincere letter. That's what it is.
And would it be okay for you to read that excerpt for us today?
Absolutely,
before we start the conversation?
It'd be my pleasure. Yeah. So here goes. I know where my love of words comes from. It must be you. Mum and Dad were never avid readers, and yet I found my way. I want to ask you what your favourite books are. What were the books you wished you had time to wade through? Yi showed me your handwritten note to her inside Little Women. I couldn't keep my eyes off your signature. I want you to read to me. I want to be 5 years old, sitting next to you, listening to your voice, and feel that for once, I have a true grandparent who calls me by my name. I want you to write my name out 1,000 times on paper, just so I can admire your strokes. I wish you could have taught me calligraphy in Cantonese. Perhaps I might have held a stronger hold on my mother's tongue had I realized it was also yours.
Thank you very much. And when I was reading, your articles and your pieces, it was this passage that struck me the most because I never met my grandfather either. And he passed away from lung cancer when I was very young. And I only knew him through snippets of stories and maybe the odd photo here and there with me in his lap. And it's so strange to know him so well but never met him through stories and other people. So, first question to you is it hard writing about a family member or your grandfather specifically?
It was a really interesting experience. I think a lot of it I didn't foresee when I started writing it. The idea came from my mum because the previous piece I'd written was about my mum. And I was like, oh yeah, sounds good. We should write about your father because he's your important figure. And he's important to all of us. I think it was difficult not because it was necessarily painful, but more because writing a person and kind of bringing them to life is difficult, especially when the memories of him aren't mine. They're obviously my mum's, and doing justice to that was a lot on my plate, I think, because I was like, I don't want to tell a wrong story. I don't want to tell an inauthentic story. I don't want to get the facts wrong, and I don't want to sensationalize or do all that. So I think it was more that as a challenge. But yeah, I felt like my position as a grandchild who had never met him before was actually quite unique, because I think there was a lot of hurt that my mum and her sisters couldn't have talked about more openly. I think as well when my mum moved abroad with my dad, there was a lot of things that got left unsaid between her and her sisters. And I felt like as an in-between person, almost I wrote in my piece, I think it was being 2 doors or a few doors down from the original hurt. meant that I could have a bit more perspective and a bit more freedom to kind of write things. And from my mum's perspective, actually, after reading it, she was like, I feel like you've almost tied the sisters together as well. Like, I've managed to somehow talk about the things that they haven't dared to talk about. So that was pretty special.
Yeah. And because you just mentioned that you wanted to get the facts right and not sensationalize, was there a lot of collaboration with your aunties and your mum just to get the story about your grandfather straight? What was that process of, research about your granddad?
Yeah. It was mostly through conversations with my mum. Like, I already knew a lot because over the years we've been talking about him. Like, that's how I feel that I had, I guess, authority and the right to be able to write about him. But there were so many, like, small nuances. Like, okay, so, like, when you walked to the post office, what was that like? What did you say? Do you remember? Like those little gestures? Like, I don't know that. So I think, yeah, it was mostly my mum, and I think at that point I wanted it to be a mum to me to him kind of a story, and then so like maybe there might be subsequent pieces where I get more insight from my other aunts, which would be lovely. But yeah, I think for that moment it was mum and me mostly talking.
Yeah, that's really amazing. For me personally, my mother doesn't really talk about my grandfather in massive chunks. It's always when we're doing something that reminds my mother of my grandfather. So, for instance, this happened yesterday, actually. We were cooking sweet potatoes. I think they were sweet potatoes. And then whilst my mum was cooking, she just brought up an anecdote of my grandfather, saying that, after World War II, he absolutely hated the sight of sweet potatoes because that was the only thing that grew in the ground in war-torn places
so funny.
And rationing places. But that was it, and my mum stopped talking about him. And I just don't know when the next time would be until I hear another story, unless I ask.
Yeah.
So I think personally for me, my family, it's always stuff in real life that only brings up the memory. We never just sit down deliberately to talk about him. Is that the same in your family?
Yeah, it kind of speaks to me as well, because I think for me, my mum's almost been surprised by her willingness to share more about him to me. I think also because my brother and I show a lot of similarities in like traits and character, in the things we like to eat and things we like to do, which I kind of try to write about in my piece as well. And I think because of those surprises, my mum was caught off guard, I think, while we were growing up. Like, say, for example, there's this kind of, like, really, I can't remember the name of it, but it's, like, very whole wheat sort of, like, bread that's, like, packaged, and, like, very dark bread. And for some reason, I love that sort of stuff. Like, I love, like, the really grainy, muesli type biscuits and stuff. And my mum's like, oh my God, like, my dad loves those. Like, he absolutely loves those. And then comes the anecdote, as you said, like, then comes the stories of, like, oh, he would eat this when he would come home from work. This was what he was like when he came home from work. Like, all those little things start to build a really solid picture of who he was, which then really ties back to my life and, like, my closeness, I guess, to him, because I'm like, ooh, like, when I eat those biscuits, I think of him as well then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Do you feel motivated or inspired to do more of this? So more family history documenting in any future writing that you do?
Yeah, definitely. Although, not gonna lie, I feel like documentation, I don't know if I'm documenting. I feel like there's different parts of me that are driven to write, obviously, about my family history. One of them is probably a bit of documenting and, like, kind of giving life to stories that have kind of been untold. There was a lot that I didn't know about my own family, which meant that, like, growing up, I didn't know enough about my own heritage. So, like, yeah, I guess documentation in the sense of, like, connecting the dots, mostly for me first. Yeah, I would love to. I think the next sort of things that I'm trying to write is my brother and I's relationship, because his experiences are quite different from mine. Like, although we follow the same timeline and we know by year, like we were in Sweden together, we were in Germany together, and then Paris, you know, the age gap, because we're 6 years apart, means that like the amount that we experienced in each of those places is different. The level of sort of solidity and like locality is different. So I'd love to explore that, definitely.
Yeah. And the generational difference, I think.
Yeah.
Because, you know, same my brother, I think between me and the youngest is about 6 years too. And even though we lived in the same places, we moved around together with our parents, you know, it's very different mentality wise.
Yeah.
And the interest in digging into the archive of the family and finding out more, I don't think he really has much interest in it, actually. But
That's
apart
really
from me,
interesting.
I really want to go back to my parents' hometown and really see for myself, you know, where they came from and where I came from.
Yeah.
And but yeah, interesting. In the excerpt, you said that you found your way. Can you explain this further?
So found my way, like in terms of writing and reading, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
I've always been reading, I think. There's not a moment in time where I think, oh, I stopped reading or anything. I think I realized quite early on, probably subconsciously, because I didn't have the like tools and the language to talk about things in a way yet. But reading was my way of asserting myself and like having something of mine. Because I grew up, I think there's a huge part that reading played in like giving me grounding, giving me sort of something to hold and remember. Yeah, and I also, because my mum used to tell me stories, like she would read to me a lot, I think I therefore associate reading as like very much the experience of reading, not just the books itself. Like I remember what I read at certain times in my life more than maybe the plot of things. So yeah, I think it's it's personal in that sense. Writing wise though, that writing took a while though to get into.
Why is that?
I think I didn't know what to write about, and I think I didn't have the language to speak about things or like know how I wanted to tell the stories of things. I think the older I get, the less sort of interested I am in like description and maybe like documenting things as like fact. I think I'm more interested in like the dots and like interweaving things. And I think when you're little, you can't properly gauge that. Like the impact of, say, a memory back in Sweden. Like I didn't know the influence of that to like my days now. So as a kid, I was like not very, I don't know what the word is, but like attentive maybe. Like I wasn't attentive enough to my own memories and experiences.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you think that could be a way of us trying to, the change in our language, I mean, from creative to more direct, do you think that's our way of making sense of it all? Trying to get to the base truths of it and not rely on too much adjectives and creative language, but to document the base truth.
Yeah.
Because I think for me, it's, you know, I'm probably similar to you. When I was quite young, I used to rely on just adjectives. I try to make it really nice and pretty and stuff. But now I feel like when I read that of mine now, I feel quite I feel it's unnecessary to do that. I'd rather get the basics down and get it direct and make it clear for myself. Is that the same for you? Do you agree with that sort of transition?
Yeah. Like even if it's creative writing, like the writers that I admire, say like Raymond Carver, who else am I thinking of? Like, obviously they're very white male authors growing up, but like say like Thomas Hardy, like even if it's flowery language, there's still a purpose to it. I think there's always intention behind words, and that's what I admire. So, and like just the way that I like to describe things, I hope that it's very just like clear cut, honest, rather than like wishy-washy. And I think that also comes from because I learned writing in a very wishy-washy way, because the school systems I grew up with were very like international school. I don't know how familiar you are with it, but like they really place emphasis on like over collaboration and a lot of sort of like stirring the pot, sort of like think about it, like, you know, think about it and things will come out of it. So I used to just not know how to structure writing. I didn't have the tools to do that. So I think it's almost like finally I realized the importance of just saying what I want to say, and getting that on paper. Yeah. I don't know.
Where did you learn to structure your writing? Because I've been told that, you know, structure is very important, not just the language itself, but how the reader experiences it through real time. Where did you learn to structure pieces?
I guess in high school really, because I went to a British school, I think paragraphing and structure in general was key. But I don't think I learnt creative writing, to be honest. I didn't even do it at uni. And so finding my own sort of voice and my take on things really took like until I left uni, I think, in like recent years. I mean, I've only left uni now. Yeah, I think there's maybe an essayistic style to my writing because I enjoy really digging into specifics, but I hope that, you know, it goes beyond just like focusing on small things and really gauging at like wider dynamics and like the effects of this and that to the individual.
Yeah. Where does the inspiration come from? Do you know the source of inspiration that spurs you on to write, or is it quite random at times?
I think it's the both. It's definitely a mix. I mean, as we've kind of touched on, very autobiographical, because I do want to write about my story, about my growing up, about my heritage, about the things that I don't know about home, my relationship with home, etc., etc. But I want to do it in a way that, like, there's obviously all the facts of that, but I think I'm someone who really trusts in gut feeling. So the guttural sort of surprise, because surprise is guttural in my opinion. Like, I really dwell on that. Like, when something really comes my way and it's like, ooh, I tend to go with that and I tend to trust that instinct. Yeah. So say with this piece, like, I think I was trying to find the links between myself and my granddad and really trying to pull things closer. Pull the past, pull him closer to now and like the influence he has now on me. But also not trying to pressure the past to like keep up with the present or something, because I think you can do that a lot with autobiographical, where you just keep looking at the past and thinking about like, oh, these are the memories, I need to like write about those, but I don't feel like you need to necessarily. Yeah.
Amazing. You know, when there's a very clear idea in your head, writing it out can seem quite easy. So then, you know, people would say it's better to have a clear idea in your head before you start writing anything. What's your thought on this? Do you think it should be, you should dabble in it first and sort of see where it goes, and then after that you can, you know, redefine it? Or do you think it's better to have it defined in your head before you start writing it? What do you think is the process that you have?
I don't know that I'm a strong enough writer yet to know like exactly what my process is, but what I found is that I just start. I think I just start, make a start, come up with beginnings, approach a topic from different angles. Yeah, like what I've done in the past, so the way I got into writing, I think, was through writing about myself and like thinking about the ways in which I introduce myself and like there are so many ways that I could do that. I could write a description of like each of the places, use place that comes first, or I could go the other way where I talk about, you know, the people I've met, or like there are infinite ways, and I think like that's how I approach things generally when it comes to writing. But yeah, I don't know that I have a process.
Sure. You're still exploring.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think
Humbly so.
I think it's amazing hearing everyone's process. It's so subjective. And I know some people who just pound out a first draft, so free writing, so they can be writing absolute nonsense, but just the act of writing helps them have a good creative process. But I know some people who are absolutely meticulous thinkers before they write anything down, just one word.
I don't know that I'm meticulous beforehand. I think the thing is, I know myself, I can get really wound up in the language of things, so then like I'll have the thesaurus up already and I'll like start thinking about wording and choice and like rearranging sentences. So I almost do a lot of just general knowledge, like research, beforehand. Like I like to think about, like if it's say my granddad, like I want to know everything about him. I want to have a fuller picture of him before I like sit down and write something about him, because otherwise I don't feel like I'm able to. I don't have enough content or substance or like nuance to anything, let alone the language.
I think also after having done the research, you need to account for some time to absorb the information. You need to digest it and
exactly. And it's not just information. It's not just information. Like it's like, how do you piece that together then? Like what comes first? Like it's not just chicken and egg. It's definitely like, okay, so like I had this very strong image while I was writing that piece of him stood on the balcony. Like when my mum told me about his rash, like he had quite fragile skin, and apparently, you know, she would always see him from behind and it was always like a silhouette. For me, that was like a huge image to go off of. Like I think it helps when you have something to like that strong, like an image, to then go off of creatively.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, it was quite interesting because when I was reading that excerpt, even though it was about your grandfather, in my head I was just imagining my grandfather the whole time. The whole time. I
think that's the effect that it had. Like it definitely, especially with the piece before that with my mum, I was spurred to write that piece because there's a lot of family stuff going on now, and I was like, I just feel like I want to come to her defense. I want to speak for her. It was spurred by anger, it was spurred by love, and I think a lot of people responded to that really strongly. Also because we're in the middle of a pandemic and a lot of people are not living with their parents right now, they're stranded in different countries. So I think, same goes with the piece on Granddad.
Yeah.
It means a lot, you know, as a writer.
I mean, it's the truth, so it's nice to know that your piece has done well. So
hopefully,
yeah. George Orwell, in his essay Why I Write, he mentions 4 motivations, and these 4 motivations all exist in every writer, but they differ in varying degrees. So the first one is egoism, so the desire to seem clever and the desire to be remembered long after you're dead, so have a legacy. Historical impulse, so partly what you've done before with this piece is to document history for posterity to read again. Political agenda, so sometimes good writing, not all the time, but good writing can be driven by a subtle political agenda. Or aesthetic enthusiasm, so how words and paragraphs look on the page, you know, how pleasing the words can be, the right words can be when put in the right order, in the right sort of structure. Do you resonate with any of these motivations? And if you can you add a 5th one?
I love this question, not gonna lie, because I think any writer, resonates with all of them. I think the one that least resonates is the egoism one. I hope that, I'm not trying to write a legacy here, but I'm also, I think, because of the historical impulse, like I am trying to write history and trying to write my family. I guess in a sense that means I'm grounding them, and that really speaks to me. I think definitely if we think of the political purpose, like I'm not trying to influence anyone, but I hope that because I'm constantly in pursuit of like vulnerability and like a bold kind of confrontational kind of vulnerability, hopefully, other people can see that, maybe use that for themselves, because I think as I could tell from the response that some of my pieces got, was that like, oh, there's so much I haven't told my mom, there's so much I want to say to my granddad, there's so much that I should be saying in this life that just often gets, pushed away because we're afraid. And like I totally resonate with that, so I hope that that's something I can bring to the table. And yeah, ultimately with the aesthetic point, I am really concerned with language. I think that's how I got into doing an English degree. That's what I'm fascinated about, words. So of course I am concerned about that, but I think to some level I think whatever works to tell the story authentically is what I'm trying to get. Like I don't know that historical impulse comes first for me, or that, thinking about the language composition is what comes first either. Like I hope that the two are really intertwined naturally. What works.
Yeah. Do you think there's a fifth motivation that Orwell missed? Do you think?
I think maybe it's not one that works for everyone, but I think for me, there's definitely an aspect of like defense, and like telling my story from me. I think not so much the ego or the political impact that you want to make, but more so to reach into a much more personal level and take up space, maybe take up personal space, think about things in a way that means that I get to say what I want to say to myself almost. I feel like that's a lot of what drives me as well.
Sure. So let me just clarify. Defense against who? So
defense, I think, of loved ones and myself, because I think maybe that's because of my own experiences feeling both ungrounded, let down. Like I have a lot of trust issues, I guess you could say, just from constantly moving and constantly seeing new people. Like I want for me, writing is a way in which I ground myself and I give warmth and realness to my own story in a way that like doesn't get other people's input, because I think there in my story a lot can be assumed. People have romanticized my upbringing to me. Like they're like, oh my god, like Paris, it's freaking amazing. But I think, if I can tell my story from myself, that's me standing up from my life and my people. I don't know if that makes sense at all.
It does. So I'm just going to clarify it back to you just so I understand. So it's a defense, and it's sort of a place where it's a pure and not corrupted thought from you.
Yeah.
And not tampered by anyone else's thoughts. So it's
pure. Is a good word, I think. Yeah.
So it's pure Jasmine.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I think you've got the words this time, because I'm just like not like leaving something uncorrupted and untampered is like, yeah, it's in a way I think a defense of yourself and like you asserting your agency. I think there's also a small element of like knowing that because I'm in a position where I can write, I want to write, I feel able to and have the time to, you know, there are so many people in this world who don't have that. You know, there are so many people who can't write because writing is ultimately an act of resistance. It's so it's maybe me also writing for those who can't maybe find the words for things or aren't able to.
Okay, that's really interesting. I never really thought about it that way. If it was me, the fifth motivation would be sort of therapy and problem solving. So / problem solving, because when you have to sit down and think things through, there's a logical process in it all. If I say this, then what are the logical consequences if I say this? And it's helped actually. It's through this problem solving. It helped me come to terms with a lot of problems that I've had in my life. And these things I've written weren't necessarily published, which is okay for me. It's not the publishing side that's.
It's the process, yeah.
It's the process, yeah. It's the healing process, and sometimes I finish just a draft piece and I just throw it away. I don't do it. It's the act of thinking it through, but sometimes it can be very painful. You know, George Orwell said that writing is like suffering a bout of illness. Is it painful? Is it painful for you to write?
I don't know. I think it's more therapeutic. Like,
it's
even
more therapeutic.
writing about difficult subjects, I think even then I don't feel like, maybe it's not about, like, I don't think I've ever like described a difficult experience literally, like, this is how much it hurt, or this is how much like baggage I now carry. Like, it's not about that. I think it's more like moving around it. I think that's how I see writing as, like, it's a I don't know if it's a vehicle. I mean, what I've definitely found, say, like through reading it to my mum, like recent pieces to my mum, to my aunts, it's really given us more relation between each other, because I definitely, for one, like, I didn't grow up with knowing a lot about my family, my extended family in particular, because of physical distance, but because of culture, because of language as well. And I think, like, because writing is a craft and it takes time and it's about the process, as you said, like, I definitely feel closer to them because, you know, it's an understanding, I think, when you're trying to write something into words, or that could apply to painting, could be drawing, could be music, like anything at all. Like, it does bond you
Yeah.
in the process of things.
Yeah. I think to write something well, you have to understand it, and then therefore connecting quite well with it.
Yeah. And therefore, if you're understanding, surely that's empathy, and surely that's like relationship building as well.
Exactly.
You're helping me think about these things now.
I'm glad. My favorite journalist and writer, I think I've mentioned him at least once in every podcast episode. So, listeners,
This
I'm
one's
very
for the fans.
Listeners, I'm very sorry, but I have to bring him up again. You know, Christopher Hitchens, when asked who his favorite writers were, he named Vladimir Nabokov as one of them. And what he said about him was quite interesting. He said that, especially in reference to Pale Fire, one of his novel, I think, poems, he said that, you know, Nabokov was like, his writing was almost like something that's not written by a human being. And I'm not sure who read Nabokov, but I kind of agree with him. It just doesn't feel like it's written by a fellow human being. And to replicate it is almost impossible because you don't know how he does it. But all you can do is just sit back and enjoy. It's a very sensory pleasure reading Nabokov, because each word just fits so well with the next word. And I just wanted to ask you, you know, is there a writer that you feel this sort of sentiment towards, that you feel like it wasn't written by a human being?
As you're saying this, honestly, I'm just like so giddy because I literally if anyone's listening to this and who follows me on Instagram, like JG Ballard, like that man is honestly my life. Like I think he, like the sentiment of, I haven't read Nabokov at all, but the sentiment of, you know, it seeming like he's otherworldly, or like the way he pins language down is so insane. That's me with Ballard. Like Ballard there's no easy way to try and describe him. I don't know how familiar you are with his work.
I've read a few reviews of him, but never read any books.
Are they mine? Yeah, no, like he's not an easy one to describe, and I think he's both somehow mainstream and very niche at the same time, because, you know, he comes under the science fiction genre, so any sci-fi reader will know of him. And then those who really love him to bits, and that unfortunately is me. And yeah, like you've really got to fall down the rabbit hole with him, and I think his interrogation of society, his just ability to diagnose and like give diagnoses to our like social, political like condition is just so weird. It's so weird because like he can describe a highway in a way that like you just wouldn't think, like a highway, like the local grocers, the like any like all the ordinary stuff that we think of as mundane, he can like elevate it to like a really weirdly like sensual, violent, extreme kind of way. So yeah, it's fascinating, I think.
What was the first thing that you read of J.G. Ballard?
I remember, I think I was 16-ish, and I read High Rise, which is about a high rise. It's about a high rise, and it's about like, it's an interrogation of social class and like people moving up the levels and moving down and intertwining, and how violence essentially like erupts amidst boredom, which is a classic theme of his. Like everything sort of erupts and it's chaos, and how people navigate that and what they do with chaos is really interesting.
Yeah, I love how enthusiastic you are talking about Ballard.
Honestly,
it's amazing. It's just so inspirational to hear. Not just what you say, but how you say it is amazing.
Oh my god, I honestly like could talk about him all day. Sadly.
No, not sadly. No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I wish we had all day, but. I've been told by several teachers it's best to, when you're starting out anything, it's best to imitate, and then after a while find your way, your own voice. You know, having heard how enthusiastic you were, passionate about J.G. Ballard, did you ever find yourself sort of imitating him in your early writings, in a way?
I think it's very hard to imitate. I think that's what makes him so amazing. But I think with him, I think it's the things he draws attention to that really caught my eye. So I found myself, you know, thinking about, like, I've definitely written about highways. I've drawn highways. I've thought about sort of thinking about bodies differently, thinking about individuals differently because of him. I don't think I've ever tried to imitate, and I hope I don't, because I would never do justice. But yeah, I think it's more that like I don't want to imitate their language or anything because it's really difficult. But I think more so like the things that authors pay attention to and the ways in which they describe things. Like it's a way in, I think.
Yeah. So not necessarily imitate the language, but the basic principle of what they're trying to do. So it's to sort of look at something a different light. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think trying to imitate is what I'm guilty of Nabokov when I was younger. Little did I know, you know, it's not going to work. You know, Nabokov is something.
You never know.
Well, I mean, reading back on him is just extremely cringy.
But I think it's true. Like people always tell me that in terms of like drawing, for example, like when you draw, you try and do, I don't even remember the word, like you basically imitate and you learn their technique, and through learning their technique you can apply it to other things, I guess, and it's that process of application, which is interesting.
You can forge your own way. So let's move on to your cultural identity, your background. So you've moved around quite a bit during your life. You're originally born in Hong Kong. I don't know, what's the order of the immigration? So it's Hong Kong and then to... Can you tell me the order?
So actually, it gets really complicated. But basically my parents were living in Japan at the time. And then because of family pressure and because I was the firstborn, they were like, oh, let's have Jasmine in Hong Kong. But, you know, a month or two later, as soon as I was ready to board a plane, they took me back to Japan. So we were there for 2 years, and then we moved to Sweden for 6 years. My brother was born there. And then 4 years-ish in Germany, and then since then Paris, which has been 10 plus years, I reckon, now. Yeah, so that's the order.
So there's a term called third culture kid, but do you think internationalist would be a better description for yourself?
Not gonna lie, I've never used or come across the word internationalist. I think third culture is always the way I've like fitted the box most. But even third culture feels enormous, because obviously, say if a kid grows up in South America and I don't know, Southeast Asia, like they're not going to have the same experience to me at all either. So almost third culture is huge. I think it's the term I use most widely, like to give it some context.
You know, I lived in South Korea for 1 year, about 2 years ago. Time's flown. And it was a very life-changing experience, because it offered me another view of life where racism didn't exist. Growing up in the UK, obviously being the ethnic minority, you always can get outcasted and picked on and marginalized, and even when you're not picked on, you're still marginalized in some way. And then finally going to South Korea when I was 23, I finally got a glimpse of what a racism-free society looked like, especially for me, because I know in South Korea there's still quite a few problems that they have regarding, you know, black people and white people, which it's quite atrocious. You know, and living in that sort of place where there's no sort of anxiety or anticipation of racism or any attacks of those kinds, you have a different personality. Because when you're in the UK, you're always on guard, you're always anxious, you're always anticipating where the next verbal or physical abuse is going to come from. But when you're in a society where you don't even think about that, a part that was hidden comes out. You're more confident, you're more relaxed, you can think about other things. So my character changed when I was in Korea.
That's really interesting. I don't know that I had that experience, because like the longest I've ever gone back to Hong Kong for was, I think, across 2 months in the summer, and I was doing an internship. And I get what you mean when you like different traits come out, because I think you didn't have to worry about race, I think. But the issue with my experience, I think, is that naturally I feel really conscious. Like, I think actually it brought out a lot more self-consciousness, because the way I dress and the way I move is very much westernized, I think, unconsciously. So I think I was quite aware of like how I looked on like public transport, even though like there's not obvious signs, but like I think 5 minutes with me will give me away like immediately. And the fact that like my Cantonese isn't amazing, and like I've always gotten like, are you Singaporean, because like you speak like Chinglish. Yeah, just like small things. I think it made me more aware actually of myself.
Yeah.
Not in terms of race, but because like as a person.
As a person, yeah. That's so interesting you mentioned behavior traits. I think about that too sometimes. It makes you really self-conscious because you're sort of analyzing the leg swing, and do I look too Western if I do this? Yeah.
Yeah, and obviously there are subtle things like do you nod, do you bow, do you turn towards this person, do you stand in front of them? There's a lot of that in Asian cultures, I think. So I'm definitely not well versed in it, so I'm like awkward.
Yeah. And not just movements, it can be fashion too. Fashion can be a huge giveaway.
Yeah.
A huge giveaway.
That tends to give me away.
Yeah. What would you say your fashion is sort of influenced by? Is it sort of, because you lived in Paris for quite a long time, do you think French fashion is infused in your choices?
I think I don't know, I dress quite dark. Like I dress very like black and white and bold colors. I don't actually go for that many colors. I think I'm a classic, like I wear docks and I like socks and and like baggy shirts and shit. Like I don't know. But yeah, I think as well, like I don't know how to do my makeup in like a way that, you know, a lot of Asian girls know. So I'm just like, I don't know anything about trends and stuff. So yeah.
Do you have many friends of Asian heritage?
That's interesting because no. So yeah.
None at all.
I do have some, obviously, but I think in general they're also diaspora, and I think that's why we get along as well, because we have shared experiences. But yeah, like I just didn't grow up having many Asian friends. I was always like one or two. There were always like me and like another guy or another girl like in my year group who were Asian. So it was always like I always understood myself as my own person. I think I had to. Yeah, and I always wish, but the thing is, like, I find it difficult as well sometimes talking to Asian women, especially East Asian women from Asia who grew up in Asia, just because there's so much I don't know how to say to them or like understand. Like I obviously really try to, and for me it's really interesting because I always think then, oh, like had I grown up there, I would probably have taken in a few more of those traits. I would probably have understood myself in this certain way. But yeah, there's always like a gap, I think.
Yeah. Sorry, you've described my experience with Asian men who grew up in Asia just exactly to the T. That's my experience too. Exactly my experience. Yeah, just it's tiring because you're always thinking about how to connect with them better.
And I want that.
Yeah, it's not like we don't want it. It's difficult, especially when you grew up with very different cultural behaviors and different languages to express things. You know, when I meet, say, Hong Kong guys who grew up in Hong Kong, even though they can speak English, there's just some things I just can't express with them how I want to express with them. There's jokes I can't tell them because they won't get it. And there's jokes they can tell me that I won't get either.
Exactly. I was going to say vice versa, because I think my experience in Hong Kong that one summer was there was so much banter that I was just kind of like chip into like, sorry, what was that? Like, I don't get it. And then they were like, oh no, don't worry about that. Like, it's nothing. But I was like, I want to know. Like, tell me, let me in. Yeah.
But there were some nice people who would translate it for you, but
yeah, definitely.
It's not the same once it's translated.
Yeah, and Cantonese is so reliant, I think, on like vernacular and like some things you can't even write. Like you can't write down. Like if you know it, you know it. Otherwise, you're screwed.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And sometimes especially if it's a joke, if it's translated from Cantonese to English, it loses its humor and potency. Exactly. It's not funny anymore. It's not funny.
It's not. It's really not. Yeah, I suddenly feel like I'm just not a very funny person in Hong Kong because I'm like, you don't get it? Okay.
I swear I'm funny, I swear.
I swear.
Given that you've lived in a lot of different countries, you've experienced a lot of different cultures, is there a sense of restlessness in your psychology? So staying somewhere for too long gets a bit uncomfortable. What's
I
your
think
experience with
there's-
this?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think there's a lot of internalized distrust, as I briefly mentioned before. I feel like there's so many people, like when I was little, obviously, I'm like, keep in touch, guys, keep in touch. And they're like, yeah, we'll keep in touch. And no one ever keeps in touch, obviously. And like you learn the hard way that, you know, most people don't take you seriously enough to want to keep things going. So I think for me, I'm always like, oh, someone's going to let me down at one point. Doesn't mean that I don't give my all to things and people, but I'm just like always aware that at some point there might be a bit of a brink
Yeah.
where we have to cross or like not cross. So yeah, I think belonging is something that I'm very aware of and like I'm maybe fighting for constantly. But I always also think like the ultimate belonging is to yourself and to like my loved ones. So I think that's what I'm trying to work towards more so than like place is gonna like solve all my problems and like give me some sort of grounding, because it's just not. And I think I've gotten this far in life kind of navigating several spaces at once. So weirdly enough, that's more comfortable to me than being in one place. But I think I'm also like sometimes at like 3 a.m. like I talk to my mom about this late at night. I'm just like, Mom, I do want to settle, I think, one day. And I think, you know, there's a part of me that really yearns for stability because like at my age, I'm young, but I'm also very tired. I think tired of like the constant sort of energy that it takes to keep going and like keep changing environments and stuff. Like I am really looking forward to really establishing myself for 5 years in the UK to get my PR. But like, yeah, like stuff like that, a lot of people just wouldn't understand. They're like, why are you so bothered by visa and like permanence and stuff? I'm like, no, but that's the sort of stuff that gives you a sense of community and like makes you a local. Like even 10 plus years in France doesn't feel like I'm a local, just because maybe it's the Parisian attitude to a lot of things and me being an outsider by color. Yeah, a lot of things like keep you anyway, like keep you apart from locality, I think.
Just firstly, it's very beautifully put that, you know, you strive to belong to yourself rather than a physical place. I think that's a very good attitude to have, because wherever you go, you're always going to be in this body. You're going to be in here. So it's better to change that rather than change the environment, because no matter where you go, you're always bringing this with you.
Exactly.
So it's better to change that.
We're all we've got, you know, this little body.
Yes.
So yeah, I think in general, I've had to have a real strong sense of self. I think that's what also friends tell me, like, oh, Jasmine, you think about things a lot, and they don't say mature, but like you clearly know yourself. And I think that as well, because I've had to self-reflect, and in order to like get into the next place or like think about the future, you know, I've had to be like, okay, this is how I like things to be, or this is how I work best, because you have to then work and do it and deal with the situation. But yeah.
How do you think coming to London will change compared to Paris? Change you specifically?
I think first off, London has a lot of people that I already know there, and I think that's a huge thing in general. Like that's a huge difference for me from Paris, because I grew up in international schools, you know, all my friends will have left at some point, their families are no longer established here, so there's very little here. Like I feel like I could leave Paris and there'd be no trace of me almost, which is weird. It's a weird thought, because I'm just like, oh, I could leave all this and like it will not bother anyone. Whereas London, I think, because there are people I really care about there, and also English is the language. It means that I can also just be myself a bit more. Like, I don't feel like I'm always having to like be second, always like trying to speak in half sentences and make half-arsed French points. like yeah. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. And just final question. Do you think you could live a life without reading or writing?
Ooh. I think I wouldn't give up reading, because if I can't write, I think I can speak, I'll draw, I'll do other creative things that mean self-expression. But I think reading is like inspiration. So it's like, it's a place that you can go to, it's inspiration for more. So I also don't think that I'm the best writer in the world. So I'm more than happy to let other people piece together things. Yeah, I don't know.
Thank you very
my
much.
thought.
It's beautifully put. But thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. This was really fun.
No, it's a pleasure. Pleasure's all mine.
So, that is the end of episode 11. It's very motivational to me, also as a writer and journalist, to explore other people's literary process, such as Jasmine's, and also to hear her passage about her late grandfather being read aloud by the very author that wrote it adds an extra layer of preciousness, and I must thank her again for being so open about it. Episode 12 is coming up for you next week, so please look out for that. And as always, thanks for listening, and we'll talk next time.